if you've been following recently, we've unpacked this idea that we are not necessarily our thoughts or our feelings, but feelings kind of to a lot, we don't have much control over them. They trigger a lot of thoughts that come down and influence behavior. So the idea that we're not necessarily our thoughts, all these things that flow around in our head, is relieving, but also scary at the same time, because we have this whole question of control. And a lot of the ideas we talked about in the last couple of episodes, especially even in this one, influenced by a book called Why Buddhism is True by Robert Wright. And in there I found the concept of false feelings, which is really interesting to think about. So if we hold this understanding that a lot of our feelings, impulses, and emotions are shaped by evolution to help us kind of survive, right? So if it's fear would be afraid of things that were bad for our survival of our genes. So that would be the role of fear. Whereas affection for, say, a child would be useful for surviving, because we'd take better care of our young. So that's why we're kind of wired to feel that way about young children. So that logically makes sense. The idea of the false feeling is the one that is actually counterintuitive, that doesn't actually serve our interests, but we feel it anyway. Now, as soon as I say that, it probably 100 alarm bells ring in your brain, as they do in mine, thinking about all the specific examples for each of us. And this is stuff I've talked about probably a lot now on this podcast, with reference to the whole Astro the dog kind of metaphor. All right, that dog in your brain that's very risk sensitive and is barking at the slightest sign of trouble. Even the trouble it misinterprets. And that's what, if you think about from dynamic examples like phobias, right? People being afraid of seemingly trivial things like clowns. So this is all this idea of false feelings. Now, it's kind of like a street sign that's just pointing the wrong way. Sometimes the opposite way to where you really want to go. And the feelings you sometimes get, these false feelings, are sending you in the wrong direction. So that's straightforward to get one's head around. Then the trouble where it becomes murky, and I think in the past this certainly stuck me up, was then there's this whole other kind of this whole other literature or whatever you want to call it about our instincts, and how your gut feel, and how listen to your heart, the whole listen to your heart cliche, and follow what you feel is the best thing to do, and trusting a lot of your impulses. So it brings up this whole dilemma of, all right, well, which feelings, impulses, and instincts do we trust, and which ones do we kind of distrust, and how to know the freaking difference? And I guess, and I don't necessarily have a magical answer or a wand-waving answer for this, but I think the ability to kind of just step back and look at the big picture is normally what I find most helpful. So for me, even now, even while I practice and speak about the ideas in my own podcast format, certainly have never ever deluded myself that I've mastered any of this. And I still get fear and trepidation over things that are actually trivial. Sometimes it's, if I think about it, I've probably had a bit of a people-pleasing thing going on. Sometimes it's being scared about getting negative feedback from people, or thinking that, I worry a lot, I guess, that people think I might be trying to take advantage of them. I'm overly sensitive of that. Even launching a new project, getting into something new. We're building the whole constant student community at the moment, which I'll be excited to tell you about soon, and launching a book. And, it's kind of been fun, hasn't really been a problem, but that now we come to like launching some of these things and building something I haven't ever built before. There's this whole scary kind of, there's this reaction sometimes when I'm looking at the work in front of me. And when you break it down into parts, it kind of looks simple, but when you look at it as a whole, it looks scarier. And that's something I talked about in the last couple episodes ago. It's so always helpful for anything we learn to break it down into chunks. So projects is obviously a really easy example to kind of talk about here, because there's always a challenge. And if you think about it, you're always capable of a certain step up at a time. Some people are just capable of different steps at different rates. All right. So a lot of people will maybe their first ever project will be like an Instagram page or a YouTube channel or something like that. But then they graduate to more and more sophisticated things. And even when you look at big entrepreneurs, you can go look at Elon Musk, for example, because there's plenty written about him. Even though he's kind of worked on some really impressive stuff, he started as a kid working on, games and stuff like that, and designed a game when he was really young. He was reading a lot when he was a kid, and obviously went and did a few different startups, but they were all each kind of stepping stones, and what he's working on now is probably more sophisticated than even the whole kind of PayPal Zip2 kind of chapter. So it's really interesting to think about. We kind of have this threshold that we kind of build, and the false feeling is often fear for a lot of us. That's one of the most relevant ones in everyday life, is fear. And I believe that I see people twist all sorts of stories and do really weird things just to work around and avoid confronting the fear of the thing they're doing. And certain people can confront it more directly than others. Sorry about that. It's really interesting to observe. People tell themselves, I guess what I mean by that, to be clearer, is people will come up with excuses like, oh, I'm too busy to do it now. I've spent a lot of my time on uni, therefore I can't do this project. From people actually opting into businesses where they don't really get much feedback, and they're divorced from real kind of feedback as well. And they always avoid putting themselves really on the line. And so there's so many ways of working around fear. So being conscious of false feelings. Let's come back to being conscious of false feelings. And so when I look at, say, a project I got to do, I guess when I step back and look at, okay, well, what's the reason this is important, or this is a worthwhile thing to do, right? So, okay, working on improving the kind of education opportunities available to us and opening doors for others. All right, it's important. And what are the actual barriers? And you can sometimes just write it out if it's really kind of worrying you. But it's dealing with it, and that's what I like about this process. It's like, well, I've protected the downside. This is my financial exposure. This is blah, blah, blah. It's the reputational damage. Well, who cares? Who cares what people think anyway? And when you walk through the process and map it out, sometimes it helps. I'm not suggesting it's a completely logical or intellectual process, because feelings work on a different wavelength to our thoughts and our intellectual ideas. But I guess that's some of the things we do to start pointing in the right direction. And I think the difference between, it's the whole cliche of the gut feel as well. And I feel like that's very different. I feel like when something resonates with you, whereas I think when you're afraid. I think one of the worst things we can do is just deny being afraid. Because denying being afraid means we won't deal with it. You can't treat an illness like cancer if you deny that you have cancer. That is a barrier to getting better. I've just admitted to you the fear I still get from time to time because of Astro the dog. I'm just primed, but it certainly gets weaker and weaker over time. I've noticed that, which allows me to do more and more, which is probably, I guess that's how we kind of climb the steps and we kind of grow or improve or journey deeper and further and wider. So yeah, false feelings are huge, and I guess it's a big theme for everything to do with Astro the dog. We've talked about all the barriers we kind of have, the way we think about ourselves, but so often confirming the reason, being clear and accepting it. So maybe you can reflect on that today. What are the false feelings you've noticed for yourself? What are the gut reactions and the way you feel and think about things that don't seem to actually serve what you want to do? And the exercise is normally writing down what Astro's saying, right? I'm afraid of this because I might be embarrassed. My friends might laugh at me. I might lose money. I might lose face. But then write down why you want to do it. Why me, Joe? Why do I want to do this? Because I see this as the best way I can open doors for others. So thanks for tuning in again to the With Joe Wehbe podcast. As you know, we'll be back again tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget that the best way to open 1,000 doors for you is to concentrate on opening doors for others.